The agriculture sector remains one of the backbones of economic activity, of livelihoods, really across the globe. And so, like any other sector, agriculture is witnessing its own boost of technology driven innovation, of experimentation. And today's guest, Dr. Lilian Ndungu, gives us an African perspective on how everyone from smallholders to national governments are applying AI in this sector. But importantly, she also pulls back the curtain on the role of government. How governments can use their power to fill gaps in data through investments in things like digital public infrastructure, but also how they can use policy and regulation to create guardrails that build in data protection, gender inclusion, and technology sovereignty for the long term. Welcome back to AI Alternative Intelligence, a podcast brought to you by Data2X. This week, we're joined by Dr. Lilian Ndungu, a leader at the intersection of agriculture, technology, and gender inclusion across Eastern and Southern Africa. Lilian works with governments to design gender-inclusive digital agricultural policies, to strengthen data governance, and to integrate emerging technologies like AI, like the Internet of Things, satellite tools, and digital platforms into national agricultural systems. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Anand.
Yeah, I'd like to start the conversation with agriculture, but also kind of use it as a foundation for broader topics. So let's start with ag. Let's start with AI in ag. Where do you see the highest potential, maybe the highest impact applications of AI in the agricultural sector today, especially on the continent?
Thank you. And I'm glad we are talking about agriculture because agriculture is really important to Africa's development. In most countries, more than half of the GDP actually comes from agriculture. And so for me, the highest impact applications for AI in agriculture fall into four connected areas. The first is smart, localized decision-making at the farm level. As you know, African agriculture is really dominated by smallholder farming. So we have a lot of diversity in terms of the plots and the farming systems. And there's the potential for AI to give us the ability to move from generic advisory to hyperlocal and context-specific recommendations. For example, if you combine AI with good soil data, weather information, and geospatial models, we can help farmers decide what to plant, when to plant, and how to optimize the use of fertilizer and water based on the realities of their own plot rather than an average situation. The second and most important area is climate and risk intelligence. We know that right now the issue of climate variability is really great, especially for rainfall-dependent systems. We have a lot of new pests and diseases that are emerging, and these are a cause of major losses in Africa. And AI can help us forecast and detect crop stress earlier, forecast pest outbreaks, especially if they're climate related, and understand how rainfall and temperature anomalies will affect yield. This is allowing governments and farmers to shift from reacting to crisis and to anticipating and preparing for them more effectively, which is really critical in a region where livelihoods are really fragile. And right now, safety nets are becoming thinner. The third is understanding that the full agri-food system is not just what happens on the farm. We are moving from a narrow focus of agriculture, and most of Africa is now moving towards an agri-food systems approach, which means that now Africa is looking at agriculture from a broader lens that is going beyond production to storage, transport, processing, retail, nutrition, and food safety. And so with AI, we can map and analyze these value chains from beginning to the end and see how crops are being grown and how they are moving through the value chain into warehouses and track where losses and bottlenecks occur to how price signals the movement through the value chains. And this is the kind of system-wide visibility that can help governments and private actors design policies and make decisions and investments that are informed by evidence rather than by guesswork. The fourth is post-harvest loss management and market optimization. I think beyond optimizing production, Africa is recognizing now that by just reducing food loss, then we can increase food sufficiency. And there's a huge role for AI helping farmers and aggregators to decide when and where to sell, routing of produce, management of storage conditions and logistics, and really to smooth out the challenges in the movement from food production to the market and consumption. And across all these, there is a quieter but very important use case, which is use of AI inside government itself. And this is something I'm very passionate about, because when we talk about AI for any sector, we are focusing on the end users, the citizens, which is really important. But at the same time, there's a huge potential in how AI can help ministries and agencies analyze large volumes of data, automate reporting, and generate internal insights that can really transform the way decisions are made. And given that all governments are working with a very small and constrained workforce, there's a lot of potential for AI to enhance efficiency in government operations.
Um, that's really quite exciting hearing those four areas, the kind of application of AI across the value chain. I want to ask a question about that value chain. As we begin to orient ourselves to applying these tools really across, from the smallholder farmer up the value chain, is there a risk here that the smallholder farmer, um, either due to lack of access or kind of their own technology constraints, ends up becoming a bit of a weaker foundation for this entire thing that we're building up above the smallholder farmer? How do you see that?
Yes, that's a huge risk, because in Africa, when we talk about smallholder farmers, we tend to view them from a point of disadvantage, because first, they're small holdings with a lot of diversity. But this
Mhm.
can actually be an advantage that Africa is actually leveraging. There is a lot of land consolidation, there is a lot of groupings of farmers into cooperatives and self-help groups that are helping them leverage the economies of scale and access credit and other information. But when I think about the challenges in terms of developing and delivering usable AI for smallholder farmers, I think the challenges fall into four buckets. There's the social and cultural, there's educational, there's technology, and there's the economic aspect, and there's also gender, which is cross-cutting. In Africa, socially and culturally, people in our local communities trust information that comes through the local leaders, the cooperatives, the religious networks, and the peers. And so, if AI is to arrive as an external and opaque system that does not connect to those trusted structures, adoption is naturally limited. There is also the current real fear and misinformation, including the narrative that AI will replace jobs, which is understandable. And when people see rapid automation, but they do not see clear safeguards or new opportunities, their first reaction is actually opposition. On the other hand, we have education. With normal technology, there was already a widening divide in terms of technology and gender inclusion. And now with AI, we are finding that on top of technology, device ownership, access to resources, there is also low AI literacy, even not just among the citizens, but also among policymakers and professionals. Many people don't understand what AI is, what it can or cannot do, and how it uses their data. Most citizens don't also understand their rights under data protection laws. So they don't know when they can say no or ask questions about consent. And so this creates a mix of anxiety and blind trust, which is not healthy for long-term adoption. And so technologically, even before we get to AI, as I was saying, we have a very uneven landscape. In Africa, only a third of the people use the internet. Many rely on feature phones, and connectivity is always intermittent, and electricity is also not reliable. So again, if we build an AI system that assumes that a high-end smartphone and constant data and fluent literacy, it will simply bypass a large segment of farmers or citizens. That's why I insist so much on multi-channel design, and mainly going beyond, for example, chatbots, to really considering other delivery channels. And by the way, for Rwanda, increasingly voice-based systems in local languages what is working. And finally, there's the economic and gendered constraints. Already we know that women and youth and low-income farmers have less access to devices, connectivity, training, and finance. If we build AI services that are expensive to access and are not tailored to their realities, then we risk widening the digital divide further. So for me, my work centers around not just making sure that we are building AI and technologies, but making sure that those tools are designed, delivered, and governed and actually fit to the realities of the smallholders rather than expecting farmers to adapt to technology.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of foundational principle of kind of working with the user, building with the user. I'm interested to dig into the gender aspect that you spoke about. I mean, I think one of the things that gets ignored in Africa and indeed across numerous agricultural sectors is the role of women, especially women smallholder farmers. They are they are a significant portion of many of these agricultural systems. But as you also pointed out, as these sectors are digitizing, and this is even before AI, there was already a significant gender digital divide broadly, a gender digital divide that then affects smallholder farmers, women smallholder farmers. As you are advising governments, as you are building technology platforms and tools, how are you hoping to address this divide, if possible, and at least making sure it's not further deepened for women?
Thank you. So the first thing is thinking about inclusion. Most of the time, the end user is usually engaged at the end of the project design, of a product design. And so we have scientists and technology development experts who are more excited about the design and the innovation rather than what it can do with the end user. And so when we think about developing technology that's responsive and inclusive, and by inclusive, it's not just about gender, it's about inclusion by age, by social, economic demographics, by disability, then we have to make sure that we put the end user at the center of these developments. For example, in Rwanda, looking at our smallholder farming, the government of Rwanda has been working on an AI voice assistant because Rwanda is naturally a talking country. And so they prefer to speak rather than to write. And so knowing that most users would rather interact, then together I've been part of the team that's helping the government develop an AI voice assistant that is matching the realities of these users, delivered through a toll-free number where farmers can call at any point 24/7 and receive advisories in Kinyarwanda, which is the local language. And so this means we are bridging device access, we are bridging uh, data access or credit access when you don't have credit in your phone to call, but also making sure that there is no limitation in terms of when you can call. At the same time, there's also the additional benefit that the staff within government, who by the way are limited, they're only two call center agents, that they are left, that the voice assistant is able to handle most routine calls where the extension and the advisories and materials are already documented, freeing up the time for the two call center agents to really handle the less routine inquiries. So that's one example. And so there are four things towards making sure that there is inclusion. One is keeping the farmer at the center of this discussion, and this could be the citizen, making sure that you understand them and their localities and their realities, and then making sure that there is a continuous consultation process where the voice is not just heard, but they are part of the design and development process. And of course, the last point is making sure that the products are heavily tested with the users and that they respond to their needs. And also the willingness to iterate. It's not always that you get it right with technology. You have to have the openness to iterate the development until it creates a match with the needs and the realities of the end users.
I'm curious about this point that you made that it's not just a talking culture, it's an interconnected culture where people trust religious leaders, local cooperatives, other local experts. How does a an AI-driven call center bridge that divide? Effectively, you're calling somebody you don't know on the other end of the line. How does that work, you think, or how might it evolve?
So in this example, the involvement of the locally organized groupings is really important in communicating and making sure that there is a level of comfort and acceptance of technology. And so working through extension officers, farmer promoters who are working with the self-help groups and the cooperatives, and making sure that that initial line of support has a really good understanding of what the technology can do, what it cannot do, and being able to respond to all their questions. Because let me give you an example. The AI will not sound like a human. So how do we get over that? It might speak in Kinyarwanda, but it will still be a robotic voice. We have to be able to communicate that. Is it going to replace our jobs as extension officers? And so the other thing is to anticipate the points of resistance and to really address them effectively. So creating that open communication channel where you are able to work with the intermediaries that engage with the farmers and the citizens and getting that buy-in. But when you think about buy-in, we are talking about communities, but it's also at the governance level. The minister needs to understand the value of this technology from a policy perspective. How will it lead to transformation of his strategic priorities? For the technical teams, why are we going through this? How does it help them? And so making sure that you're able to map all the users of a system from a policy and strategic perspective, because that's the first level of buy-in, then within the government, and then down to the lowest levels, and creating those open communication channels is really important, and especially communicating what the technology cannot do.
Um, I'm curious also about data or the lack of data in this. I mean, all of these systems have to be built on a kind of data foundation that we know in emerging markets is not quite as robust as perhaps we would like. How are places like Rwanda addressing this sort of data gap as it builds more AI systems for the agricultural sector, for other sectors? What's the path forward here for people who are worried about the data gaps here?
Yeah, so one of the most important things is that you cannot build credible AI systems or any credible technology system without a very solid data foundation. And that data needs to be available consistently and with very clear quality audits. And so that is the first biggest challenge in Africa. That one, where is the data? Is that data available consistently? And how are we making sure that the quality of that data is up to date? And so the first thing that comes into play is the ongoing evolution, because most ministries of agriculture have evolved. When we first began building technologies for governments more than 10 years ago, there was a rapid adoption of what was called the management information systems. And these were they were systems that were supposed to manage collection and quality auditing of information from the ground up, but this did not happen. So they ended up being systems without clear um, governance, without clear quality audits. And so they are still sitting there in most governments, but they're not usable. And now, from the African Union level up to government level, many countries are beginning to wrap their minds around the concept of DPIs, the digital public infrastructure. So building interconnected systems that transform the way they collect, manage, and ensure the quality of data to reduce the level of duplication and to really create a very level playing ground, not only internally in terms of how data is consumed for decision making and policy development, but also in how the private sector is brought on board. And DPIs are very critical because one of the challenges right now, if I may mention it, when you think about a farmer, before we had systems where we have sorry, we had a system where we had a farmer recorded as we have a whole livestock management system, and we have a farmer recorded as producing livestock. Another value chain system such as maize or coffee, where the same farmer is recorded. And so there's a lot of duplication. And so DPIs are bringing a bit of coherence, a lot of coherence, by uniquely identifying a farmer and then making sure that all the activities of a farmer are effectively captured. And most governments are building DPIs as the core foundation for identifying farmers, what we call the one true source of truth. And so above the DPIs, then that is where you have AI. So most AI, and let me just say, above the DPI, there's a geospatial layer that's needed. In some cases, geolocation is part of the DPI. In some cases, it's an additional but critical component. And then AI comes on top, where you have a foundation of credible data with clear governance strategies. So meaning that when you have a DPI, you need to have a data strategy and a governance framework. Most countries are also developing this. You need to have a very robust geolocation system that allows you to disaggregate data, to disaggregate recommendations beyond national and sub-regional level. And then on top of that, then you need to have the AI. But there's still a huge gap in terms of the enforcement of mechanisms that are there to ensure the quality of data and the audit of that data. And I really hope that more ends up being done, especially in investments, to really collect African data, to characterize the people, the land, and all the systems in such a way that AI that's built in Africa captures the realities of African citizens and African landscapes and systems.
Anytime you bring up DPI and citizen data, you also have to begin to think about concepts like data protection. Rwanda is, I think, ahead of the game, certainly a leader in the continent in terms of developing policy and regulatory approaches to technology broadly. It has an AI policy that it released recently. It's had a data protection act. How does this kind of willingness to lean forward in shaping policy affect the technology sector, but especially its application in things like agriculture? How are you seeing Rwanda's reality play out as one of the countries that's done this first?
So thank you, Anand. And Rwanda is actually one of the exemplars in Africa in terms of exploration of emerging technologies. And I'm actually really proud to be here for the last close to 4 years, supporting the government in terms of how they translate their technology priorities into actionable products. And just to mention, there are three documents that I'll talk about. And the first one is the AI policy. This was released in 2023, and it explicitly frames AI as a tool to advance national development priorities rather than a standalone tech agenda. And it also identifies critical sectors. And actually, the prioritization of agriculture came out of some of the contributions from myself and a whole other large team of experts, where we said, we know you have a lot of sectors where you want to test these policies, but can we start with agriculture? And out of that, we've had several use cases around development of AI for the agriculture sector. The second one, maybe just to add on the AI policy, is that the second thing is that it emphasizes on the ethics around AI, the human-centeredness that is required, and inclusive AI. So paying attention to things such as transparency, accountability, bias, and distribution of benefits. And this is very important for agriculture because, as you know, technology systems, and now when we talk about AI, it's very easy to generalize, overlook the needs of women, youth, people with disabilities, and communities that really might not have the same benefits as others. And so it calls for intentionality. The second document that I want to talk about is the Data Protection Act. Now, we have the National Data Protection Act. As strategic advisors to government, TBI has worked with the Ministry of Agriculture to really translate what the Data Protection Act means for the agriculture sector. And through that translation, we identified and worked with the government to develop a data and analytics strategy together with Senfree, and to also build a data sharing framework. So this is a legal backbone for how data is collected, stored, and exchanged between ministries and external actors. On top of that, we build specific data sharing agreements, because when we think about actually implementing data sharing, it's not a one-to-one situation. There are very many scenarios towards data sharing, and lack of clear mechanisms on how data is shared actually limits, because we'll say, yes, we can share data with you, but because we don't know what we should or what we can share with you or what we should request in exchange, then you find that those requests are either not met or not well defined. And so beyond the Data Protection Act, there are additional instruments that we've worked with the Ministry of Agriculture to implement, to define consent, purpose limitation, clarifying obligations for the institutions, and ensuring that there is clarity in the safeguard for citizen rights. And for example, with the DPI for the agriculture sector, even though we want to really unlock the power of data, not just for government, but for private sector investments and prioritization in the agriculture sector, there is right now, because of these frameworks that I've talked about, there is clarity on what can be shared and what cannot be shared. And so this strengthens the capacity of government to really safeguard citizens' data and citizens' rights. So I would say the other thing that Rwanda is quite ahead on is on gender inclusion. I would say in terms of inclusion, but I think we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, yeah. Let's dig into that. I mean, what is Rwanda doing specifically to ensure that its women are included in these systems, in the kind of the great advances that it sees as AI is directed towards national development priorities?
So if I may talk about, let's begin with the agriculture sector.
Mm-hmm.
There is joint land ownership. If you get married, when you're signing your marriage certificate, you have to define resource sharing. And the default is 50-50. And so it's a way of protecting women's ownership in terms of land rights, because as you know, women are the main um, they do most of the agriculture activities. And there is also a lot of empowerment of women as leaders. There are a lot of women that are there are a lot of women that have been selected as farmer promoters. There's a lot of women leadership in these self-help groups and organizations, but we also have the largest number of leadership that are women, including ministers. So there's a lot of support in Rwanda to ensure not just inclusion, but women empowerment at all levels, not just at the farm level, but also in all other areas.
So
And so
I'm
when it
hearing.
comes to AI, so
Yeah,
then
go ahead.
the foundation, sorry, Anand, so that
No,
is
no,
the
go ahead.
foundation. So the foundation is empowering women to lead. So when you empower women to lead, then it means that you're removing barriers to their access to information and resources, but you're also giving them the capacity to be, to voice, to amplify their own voice, their capacity to speak and be heard. And that's really important.
I'm hearing a very strong role of the state here, creating legislative backbones, creating a kind of regulatory environment, a set of policy priorities um, around data protection, around gender inclusion. Um, is that a model that other African countries can follow? Is this something you're hearing from other governments? That are they also willing to play as strong a role as the Rwandan government has? What do you think is the mood of the day on the continent, to the extent that you can assess it?
Yeah, so as you know, I've worked in around 17 countries, and I've held mentorship for women in climate development and climate forecasting, as well as in other areas around technology development. And also worked with governments across many of the East and Southern African countries and a bit in the West. What I can tell you is that there is a recognition that our policies and our systems and our technologies need to be more inclusive. And in most policy development processes, there is a consideration for gender inclusion. However, there is still a huge gap in translating policies into action. For example, if you look right now in most strategic plans for agriculture, there is a requirement for gender budget statement, meaning that whenever they are submitting their budgets, they are required to identify areas where there are gaps in gender inclusion or representation, and to propose measures and budget allocations towards meeting those gaps. But the problem, and I'll state from examples that I know of, is that even though there is the articulation of gender as a priority, there isn't always measurable and accountable indicators in strategic plans to guide the accountability and inclusion mechanisms. So in short, we are being vocal about gender. We have instruments that can really strengthen gender inclusion, but we are not yet at a place where we can comfortably say that we can adequately create, or we've adequately created measurable indicators and accountability indicators within our strategic plans to measure the gender inclusion parameters more effectively. And if you look at data, most of the time we really categorize our data as male and female. And then we bring the social cultural aspect of, if I put an age requirement in participation for meetings, people tend not to want to put their age group, right? So they omit that. And yet, this is really important in assessing how well we are being inclusive beyond the male gender disaggregation, to looking at how, across the different parameters that define inclusion, how sensitive we are. And when we talk about technology again, there's a huge opportunity for strengthening the capacity of systems and analysis to really capture the diversity in the needs of different user groups. And I'll give one example. Previously, we worked on a project to assess if including gender disaggregated indicators or gender critical indicators would really transform the identification of climate hotspots in Africa. And when we added gender inclusion indicators, the maps were totally different. And these are maps that are used to prioritize areas for interventions. And without including the gendered requirements, you tend to miss the point. And so we were talking to the technology developers, the women, people in climate technology, in agriculture technology, and demonstrating that even when you're designing these important technology components and analysis, you have to make sure that indicators that capture the requirements of both genders and of different socio-demographic indicators, it needs to be accounted for, because the outcomes and impacts are really going to be different if those are not considered.
That's fascinating. I'm also curious, and perhaps we can kind of end on this topic of data sovereignty, because as these technology systems are built, I think there's an increasing awareness that these technology systems, AI systems or others, are not always built by or for the African context. How are countries and governments dealing with that? I know it's a priority in Rwanda. What are you hearing from government policymakers?
Yeah, so I'll handle it from a more broader perspective
Mm-hmm.
and really talk about the things that define true data and technology sovereignty. And this applies to any country in Africa, and Rwanda has been at the forefront of really owning this. And from my interactions, I'll also speak broadly about what needs to happen at the African level. So the first thing is, we need to own and govern our core data sets. Every country needs to own and govern their core data sets about citizens, about land, about agriculture, about health, and so on, under legal frameworks that are clear, fair, and locally accountable. If those data sets are being put entirely on infrastructures that countries don't control, or under contracts that we don't fully understand, then that makes us vulnerable. The second thing is that, for me, sovereignty means being able to decide how those data sets feed into AI systems. I usually say that AI, as of now, it's a rabbit hole. You see, once you feed data into an AI model, you can't withdraw it, right? Unless you're feeding it into a temporary memory. So this means that we need to have better structures around who can train models on our data, for what purposes, and what happens to the models afterward, and how value created is shared. Right now, there's a real risk of African data becoming fuel for external AI systems without transparent governance or benefit or clarity in benefit sharing. And that thing, and it's something we're already experiencing in several African countries, is that there needs to be a sovereignty in hardware and energy dimension. So AI depends on compute capacities. GPUs, for example, for our AI voice assistant, we could only stimulate or simulate natural conversation using GPUs. And so we need GPUs and accelerators, which in turn have a huge demand on electricity. And so right now, we not only need to build our infrastructure, but we also need to build on our green energy. So if we want to run serious AI workloads at scale, we need, and this includes local large language models, large geospatial models, then we need to invest not just in data centers, but also in green and resilient energy. Otherwise, we will always be constrained by power, or we'll end up having to ration households and schools and hospitals over limited electricity resources. So the fourth thing is about the African scientific and engineering leadership. So I have been part of a lot of global collaborations that have really built amazing technologies. But when we want to talk about sustainability for not just technology, but AI, we need to build those models. We need those models built, even if through a collaboration by African scientists. Right now, for most of the technologies that I am part of, there's a huge emphasis on having a co-development team that is made up of African scientists. They can be backstopped by global partnerships, but that need for local scientific leadership is important for ownership, for sustainability, and for really building AI and technologies that respond to our African realities.
I'm really struck by this last point about kind of local scientific capacity. Um, is there a pipeline of that talent, and are there the kinds of educational um, institutions that are needed to develop that talent and make sure that it really is available to the governments of Africa?
Yes, so it's really interesting that there have been a lot of groupings of scientists seeking to develop African language models. We have the Masakane Foundation in South Africa that has brought a lot of AI, streamlining a bit of the AI development in Africa. Here in Rwanda, we have Baza AI, Digital Umuganda. We also have a group that I've personally worked with known as KINLP, which has developed a Kinyarwanda language translation model. And across Africa, we are also seeing a lot of networks emerging around coordination and development of AI for Africa. However, there is also a lot of duplication. For example, in Kenya and in East Africa, we have partners or innovators who are working on Kiswahili language models, but there's still a bit of silos in terms of coordinating these networks and really making sure that there is a lesser level of duplication in efforts. At the same time, on the technology level, there are a lot of discussions happening around African Union and in most countries around building their own cloud computing infrastructure and also deploying GPUs. Strive Masiyiwa is through his cassava technologies is bringing GPUs to Africa. But the biggest challenge right now, at least in 2 or 3 countries that I know of, the adoption of those GPUs is actually limited by the energy requirements. And so there's that difference, that there's a mismatch that we need to really quickly unlock as Africa in terms of developing green energy, strengthening coordination around AI innovation and development to reduce duplication and to also strengthen the capacity of Africa to really build its own technologies or to lead the development of its own technologies and AI and to own them.
Um, Thank you, Dr. Lillian. I'm encouraged and sort of energized by this discussion. I've worked uh, for a big chunk of my career actually with African technology innovators working in the agricultural sector, and so hearing about all of these innovations and all of this sense of possibility is really energizing. Thanks for your leadership in that. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Anand. It was a pleasure to join you.